Hi everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. If you've had an encounter of your own and would like to speak with me whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. Before we bring on tonight's guest, I want to remind you that the subscription program has started. If you'd like to listen to the show without commercial interruptions, please go to dogmanencountersradio.com and visit the How to Listen page to find out more about becoming a premium member. As you'll see on that page, the subscription fee for becoming a premium member is $2.99 a month. If you want to listen to the show free of charge and don't mind the commercials, the Dogman Encounters YouTube channel is what you're looking for. As always, thanks for listening. Alright, let's bring on tonight's guest. A lot of you are going to remember tonight's guest from episodes 62 and 64. When he came on and did those two episodes, he talked about sightings of the Flixton Werewolf as well as other Dogman sightings across the UK. I'm glad to invite him back to talk about more Dogman cases he's been investigating. Of course, I'm talking about Paul Sinclair. Paul, thanks so much for coming back.
Thank you very much, Vic. It's a pleasure to be back. I'm sorry it's been so long, really. I've not got any detailed accounts, but we have got a few very interesting accounts that I'm working on that I'm hoping to speak to you about tonight, Vic. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm just glad to have you back.
Thank you.
Paul, it's been a while since you've been on the show. For the listeners who didn't hear the previous two shows you've done, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Right, Vic. Yeah, thank you. Well, as you know, I did the two shows previously, but like you said, for the listeners, I live here in Bridlington in the UK. I'm a researcher of all things strange, I probably would say, UFO-related, Dogman-related information, which I didn't think I'd really get involved in, but it's just ran and ran because I realise it is massive. Here in the UK, I'm married, 4 girls, all grown up and left home, doing their own thing. I'm age 54, pretty much able to do what I want now. And yeah, I got into the Dogman subject whilst researching for my book, which is now published and on Amazon and for sale on Waterstones as well, called Truth Proof, The Truth That Leaves No Proof. It's full of mostly first-hand accounts of unexplained events and quite a lot regarding the Flixton Werewolf and other similar creatures up and down the East Yorkshire coast, readers and listeners that might be interested. I first became interested in this subject whilst researching the book, and I've literally been hooked ever since, Vic.
Oh, I can understand why you would be. For the listeners who are thinking about buying your book, I can't recommend it highly enough, so I hope they do go out and buy that.
Thank you very much. I don't want to dwell on the book too much, Vic, because you're the main focus of what we're doing, and you're at the front of this Dogman research. I think everybody who is involved in it realises that, and full respect for you. But if I can just touch on it, if you find it on Amazon, just type in Truth Proof into Google, 2 words, it'll be the first line that comes up. It's been reviewed very well by some of the best people in the subject. Whitley Strieber has given me some fabulous words, Peter Robbins, who wrote Left at Eastgate, and as I say, a lot of the book is devoted to the Flixton Werewolf and we'll call them the Dogman-related encounters. So I think it would be interesting, but that's me being a bit selfish and pushing the book, so I apologise.
Not selfish at all. You can't promote it enough. It's a great read.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. There's an encounter that took place at a place called Sands End that you've been investigating. What can you tell us about that?
This encounter, Vic, came to me probably 6 weeks ago. To get to the story, I first need to go backwards a little bit to get to Bempton, the cliffs of Bempton, which are about 4 miles from where I live. There's a lot of strange, unexplained lights and aerial activity over the sea at the moment, so we've been spending quite a lot of time up there. And what happened is the rock angling season starts on the 1st of October till the end of December along the East and North Yorkshire coast. It may do all the way along the UK, but that's all I know as regards the rock angling season. And obviously we're up there at this particular time because a lot of the anglers have seen these lights. So I've got to know a few of them, and this particular day, or evening should I say, probably 9:30, but it's pretty dark at that time, we're in October. There's an angler arrived at Bempton. He's travelled a fair distance and he's come from Durham. We're looking at a 70-mile journey. We get talking and I tell him I'm after filming the lights and speaking about a few unusual things. He begins to tell me about something he saw at Sand's End, which will be 36 miles away from Bempton. I was sort of intrigued because I'd come to sort of search for these lights or try and get some film footage of them. And he says he'd set up, it were a fishing match, and he liked to fish alone because he didn't want people sort of fishing in good spots that he's in. And he's on the edge of these cliffs, and he's been fishing for a few hours, and he became aware of a noise. Now, all these anglers wear headlights, with the LEDs on the front. And he flicked his headlight on, and he's sort of looking up and down the cliff, and he caught eye shine. Now, it sort of puzzled him. He realised there were no one else fishing in that vicinity, and these eyes were sort of glowing a yellowy-orange colour. And this sort of unnerved him a little bit. But what unnerved him even more was the eyes, or the head, ducked down. It didn't sort of freeze in the lights like a rabbit would do, but it was nothing like a rabbit. It was quite high up. So he briefly looked at his rod, then looked back, and this thing is looking up again, or looking directly at him again. And he says that the head ducked down once more, but it seemed a bit closer. And he's got, I think it's a Cree headlight, a real powerful thing. So he's looking at this thing in the distance. So at this particular time, he's unnerved, but he's not frightened. And he looks again, it ducks down, seems a bit closer. And all of a sudden, the fear just overcome him. He cut his lines. He didn't bother trying to reel in and pack his gear away. He cut his lines, picked the rod up, got the fishing box on his shoulders, and proceeded to walk along the cliffs to what he thought would be safety. And each time he looked back, this thing was following him. Or he says it was, glowing yellowy-orange eyes. And he says he thinks it was hunched over, like sort of walking hyena-like. That came up in a conversation with someone else, actually, a few days ago. But it were definitely taller than a dog, but not huge. We're not talking like 7 or 8 feet tall. But it was nothing like he'd seen before, and as listeners will be aware, there's no way a deer's going to follow him down a cliff-top path. So he became very frightened, and he got away. He's never fished that place since, but it turns out, after he was telling me about it, that he's not the only man that's seen this. Now, that's an interesting account, Vic, that I'm still looking into, because I've not had this long. It was the fact that it ducked, it reacted to the beam of light, but carried on coming forward. It sort of sparks fear into anybody, or I think it would. And the fact that it was hunched over, he believes it was hunched over and walking on all fours, but hunched over. There's not much more to add to it. Oh, other than, close to Sand's End, that's what I was fishing for, why I paused when I was talking just then, so I apologise, listeners. Close to Sand's End, on the edge of them cliffs, there is an area of land called Beast Cliff, or Beast Cliffs. Now, I find that interesting. These are little things that I find interesting, and I'll be looking into Beast Cliff. So perhaps any of your listeners who want to do a little bit of research, UK or overseas, just find Sand's End and you will find on a map, you'll find Beast Cliff. Now, I want to know why it's called Beast Cliff. At this present time, I've not spent enough time researching it to get any answers on that, and hopefully, if we speak again, I will have some. So that's the brief one, Vic, that I've got for you there.
Wow, Beast Cliff. If there ever was a good place to stay away from, I think that'd be a good candidate.
I agree.
Sounds pretty intimidating.
The next one, Vic, comes from a place very close to where I'm sat now, at a place called Hasthorpe, which will be 3 miles away at the most. I became aware of Hasthorpe from a mutual listener to your radio show, Stuart Wright. He's a security guard who sort of works unsociable hours as security guards do and is all over the country, but at this particular time he was working at Hasthorpe. And he made me aware of a large black dog that had been sighted in the area. He's ex-military, Stuart, so he sort of knows the lie of the land and can work things out, and he's pretty savvy. And some of the people who worked under him had reported that a couple, a man and a woman, had stopped their car. They'd reported that this huge black dog or cat, they weren't sure what, had ran across the road in front of them and up the field, and they'd got it in their security log. And Stuart contacted me because he'd heard me talking to you on the show about Flixton. So I went up and spoke with Stuart. I spent some time with him. But we later found out, close to Haysthorpe is an industrial estate called Bessingby, the Bessingby Industrial Estate. And this is, once again, these are accounts that I'm still looking into. This is late 2014 through to 2015. I'm told that there is some CCTV footage from one of the industrial estate units at Bessingby that has footage of this huge black dog. I'm still trying to locate it. The reason we know that is, Stuart told me this, there's an old guy, he'd be able to confirm it to you as he speaks to you if he does. There's an old guy who used to walk a large Doberman dog around, and he got stopped by the people on the Bessingby Industrial Estate to ask if his dog had escaped. Well, obviously, he said that his dog hadn't, but they'd got footage of a huge black animal, I think a lot bigger than a Doberman, but they were just clutching at straws because they just couldn't explain what they'd seen, and they've got footage of this thing. A few weeks after this report of the dog, Stuart writes security guard log entry of the couple that had seen the huge black dog as well, a dog-stroke cat, I have to admit, at Bessingby. Military Apache helicopters were sweeping the fields very low, literally as low as I suppose they dare go. That doesn't mean, they're looking for this creature, but to be in a sort of an industrial area and have military helicopters, they were going up and down the fields, they were sweeping the fields, just begs the question, what for? So that is the gist of that account, Vic. That's all I've got on it at this present time.
If the people in that chopper caught anything on film, it sure is a shame that we're never going to see it.
Well, I have tried, Vic, and I've been up onto industrial estate speaking to people at the units, and I have failed, I must admit, but it doesn't mean I'll stop. Strangest things occur and strangest little bits of information come out when you never expect them. Now, I do have another account here that came to me about 3 weeks ago. I'm linking these two together because of location. Haysthorpe, once again. Listeners, please understand that because these are quite recent, I haven't got loads of information on them. But a guy contacted me who owns a small holding close to Haysthorpe, and he told me that at the back of his paddock, where he's got two sheep in, just two sheep, and he informed me that the sheep are aware if there's a fox or anything, they're quite skittish and they're aware. And nothing made sense in his account to himself and to me because the sheep didn't seem fazed by what they saw or what he saw. He said he'd never seen anything like it. He says, and at the top end of his paddock, he says there's a hedge about 4 foot tall. And at the back of the hedge is a drop of a few feet. And he claims that going along the hedge at the other side, he could see the slinking shoulders of what he thought was a huge black cat, but the back end of the body resembled a dog, the back of it. He didn't see the head. And, well, he said he couldn't understand why his sheep seemed unfazed. His sheep didn't even seem aware of this creature. And he unnerved him and frightened him a little bit. And he said he's never seen anything before it or since. So that is all I've got of that account so far, Vic.
That sure is strange. If a predator was around, especially a large one like a Dogman, you'd expect those sheep to respond. I wonder why they didn't.
Well, once again, Vic, I'm sort of not going to draw any definites because I simply don't know. I think I touched on the fact that I thought it might have been paranormal, interdimensional in nature last time, and there'll be a lot of your listeners thinking, what's he talking about? He's talking a load of rubbish. And maybe I am. But what you've just said there in itself, Vic, why didn't the sheep react to this thing? Why has this guy contacted me with such a bizarre story? He's not really interested in any kind of publicity, or if publicity is the word. And, you know, it just begs the question, what is it that we're dealing with? So, if you like, Vic, I could tell you another brief one from Flixton.
Please do.
As I said in the Flixton Werewolf talks that we did last year, Folkestone and Flixton are very close together. In fact, you wouldn't know one from the other. You don't know when you've left one and joined the other. And this involves a farmer who has a farm in Folkestone, less than a mile from the other end of Flixton. His farm is low-lying on what's called the Seamer Cars, and I've described before the Cars are an area of wetland which once used to be known as Lake Flixton. 11,000 years ago it was a huge glacial area of land. Now this guy claims that he's seen the Flixton Werewolf. He says it was the werewolf. He's absolutely of no doubt, and it was a daylight sighting. Once again, just off the A1039 road, where a lot of these sightings seem to originate from or around, but maybe that's simply because everything around Flixton runs along the A1039 road. So he said he's in his farmyard, going about his normal business, and he looks across over the fields and the land, which a lot of it he owns, and it's lush, open, flat land. It's not flooded, but it's quite marshy. It produces lovely rich grass. And he's got horses in the field. And he realises that the horses seem distressed, and they're absolutely belting across the field towards the farm. And they get into one corner of the field, and then he sees it. And this thing is running like a man across the field in broad daylight. And he says it was the werewolf. I didn't have to prompt him. He says it was the werewolf. And he spoke about, there was someone else with us actually at the time. I'm not saying Farmer's name, but there was Ted Harwood with us at the time, who wasn't, he's not really bothered whether I said his name or not. And Ted is 6'1". He says, and if you looked at Ted and put him over there, this thing was close to 2 feet taller than Ted. And it was running, he said, and he commented how fast it was. He said it was so fast, he said it was really, and then it stopped and sat in the field, and then set off again up into the woods. So that is the latest, well, probably not the latest, because there is something else, but that is 2015, seen by a farmer in Flixton. An interesting take on it, what the farmer believes, it is, his words again, supernatural. He believes it comes when somebody's died or if somebody's going to die. Now, once again, listeners, I'm not subscribing to this. I can only say what people tell me. So you have to believe what you want to believe, what you find is your truth. I mean, because I don't think any of us know what we're dealing with this. I have spoke to Larry Sespooch. He's, I wouldn't say an authority, but he's really interested in this kind of thing. He talks a lot about the skinwalkers. And I've spoke to Larry quite extensively, and he believes that the Flixton Werewolf is what they would call a skinwalker. Now, whether that's true or whether that's wrong, I don't know, but I'm just repeating what Larry thinks, and he comes out with some really interesting and profound things. He can be found on YouTube on quite a lot of things talking about skinwalkers, to be honest with you. So that basically is the Flixton sighting that I've got, Vic.
Do sightings of the werewolf seem to be widespread in that area, or is it just that farmer who seems to see it?
Good point, Vic. They're widespread in this area. Flixton, as you know, has a history of these kind of sightings from the people that I spoke about previously. Yet it would appear that sightings of the werewolf, for want of a better word, I don't think werewolf's the name we should be using, but that's only my opinion. Sightings of a creature like this are widespread in the area, and it's just amazing how many of the locals to the area, by local I mean people who've lived there lots and lots of years. I've been informed years ago that you're not local if you've lived there 40 years. That's how close-knit this community is. Now, they know about this creature. I've also touched on other strange bits with the Flixton Werewolf, that the very old, not old as in age, the very old families of the area have a lot more knowledge of the Flixton Werewolf or this creature than we're led to believe. I've been told it's some kind of secret. Quite whether it is or not, I don't know. And that's pure speculation. It's only what I've been told. So I'm just sharing that with you. Somebody else might do a bit of digging and find something out and enlighten me, and I'd be delighted.
Did that farmer ever see that creature do anything that would point towards it being supernatural, or did he jump to that conclusion?
He jumped to that conclusion. I've no idea why, and I will be speaking again to him, so that's a question I could ask. I haven't done. These people, Vic, and you'll come across it and other people researching, it's very difficult getting information out of them. You know, I mean, I don't know whether it's just the sheer bizarreness of what you're asking them and the fact that they're finding it even hard themselves to believe what they've seen. I don't know what it is, but it's real difficult. It's the same with UFO subject, if I'm being truthful. They can't deny they've seen it, but at the same time, they don't really want to put the name to it. It's difficult. Now, Vic, I do have another one which is quite close to Flixton at a place called Langtoft. I think we're looking, as the crow flies, probably 12 miles away. This is another farmer, and he lives in Langtoft, and he uses a drone. And the purpose of the drone is to look for deer. Now, I'm told that the drone has a camera on it with 10 million pixels, which I suppose that's quite good. And he uses this and he sort of searches for deer. And he also uses it for metal detecting, I'm told, as in he can see different anomalies in lie of the land. And that's a hobby that he likes to do. But while he's using this drone looking for the deer and seeing what's happening, in a few frames of the film, when he's playing down to, I don't know whether it's a monitor or his phone, I would think it's something like an iPad, he captures something that he thinks is a bear in just a few frames of the footage. He goes back over it with the drone and it's gone. Whatever it was gone, but he thinks it caught a bear in the footage. Now, as everybody will know, we've got no bears here in the UK, so what do we have? Or what could it be that could resemble a bear? So that is that brief but sweet report that I've got there for you. Now, Vic, I'd like to take you to a place called Harwood Dale, which is part of the North Yorkshire Moors National Park. And the North Yorkshire Moors seems to have quite a lot of Dogman-related reports and strange creatures sighted. So Harwood Dale, incidentally, is very close to Beast Cliff, which we talked about earlier. It's a huge area of woodland, quite unpopulated and quite remote, although it's frequented by walkers. Now, this account puts the Dogman, or the creature, into the realms of supernatural, but it's no less intriguing because I believe the guy who told me. So this guy was with two other men mountain biking. They were only young men at the time, and I think it goes back to 2006, and they were mountain biking at Harwood Dale. And they lived up round that area, or at least this guy did. He says that they were familiar with terrain. He says, in fact, we'd made most of the tracks and paths up there in our youth, and we were flying about on mountain bikes around this area. And every few hundred yards or so, there would be a fire break, which will sort of make sense in a while as we go a little bit into this story. He says, and they're going down this particular path, and terrain's just bracken with odd trees dotted about either side of them. The bracken's 3 or 4 foot high. Says in that corner of his eye, at this time he didn't know if his two friends had seen it, he said he just spotted something sort of travelling parallel to him. Says, and he shouted his mates, have you seen that? Because they're all in a line, I'm not even sure. Yeah, he was behind, and there's the other two in front. He says, have you seen that? And they looked, they said, yeah, we have, yeah. And he describes what he said, it looked like an upright gorilla travelling at the side of them, about 30 foot away at the other side of some bracken. He says it was 3 or 4 foot taller than the bracken, so he estimates it were 8 foot tall. But where it becomes interesting or highly unusual, if seeing a upright gorilla isn't unusual enough in UK, that he said it looked like it were floating on a track. His exact words, he said, we couldn't understand it. He says, we put all them trails in, or we sort of made them all with our bikes in our youth and as we got older. He says, and we knew lie at land. He says, there was nothing at the other side of the bracken but more bracken, logs, rocks, everything. He says, and this thing was just moving on a smooth line. He says, we're going up and down, we're jumping fire breaks. We can see this thing, and it's looking at them. Because I asked him, I said, was it aware of you? Oh, yeah, it was aware of us. And I said, well, you know, I said, so what was at the back of it? He said, nothing but woodland and bracken and logs and rocks. He says, yeah, it just kept on a steady, constant course down this gradient, keeping up with us. I can't remember exact amount of distance he said it covered, but we can get to that later if I put it on to the Facebook page. But this thing literally followed them for hundreds and hundreds of yards. And he said it looked, for all intents and purposes, it looked like an upright gorilla. Now, I've never heard one like that, Vic, that appeared to be floating And I've said all these sort of strange things that must have sounded ridiculous and patronising to him. I assure it weren't some kind of dark mist. He assures me it were about 9:30 at night in summer, so it was still quite light. No mist, lovely clear night. All three of them could see this thing. Upright gorilla, travelling same pace as them as they were going on mountain bikes down Harwood Dale. Like I said a bit earlier, very close to Beast Cliff, very close to edge at eastern North Yorkshire coast. These things, we'll have to say things, there's got to be more than one of them. They must be operating up and down this coast. Like we touched on before, Sand's End is only 36 miles from Bridlington. Then at the moment, you've got a lot of talk about the Beast of Barmston Drain, which I think some of your readers and have put little snippets on front papers that have been reported. Barmston Drain, obviously Barmston is the place the Barmston Drain finishes and where it enters the sea. And that's 6 miles from where I'm sat. From there, the Barmston Drain runs inland into Hull. It's a man-made drain. And for any listeners, it's not a drain as in underground, it's land drainage. But the areas it meanders through are quite remote. And I know I've sort of jumped a bit there, because I don't mean to downplay the lady that claims that she's seen the Beast of Barmston Drain, or the other people that have seen it. I've never spoken to them, but I do believe that they've seen something highly unusual. But I'll just stay on that one just for a second, because a lot of the stories connected to the Beast of Barmston Drain, as in it allegedly attacked a timber wagon, and they've connected that to Hull, which is 40 miles away. They've muddied the waters a little bit because the timber wagon account is on the A1039 in Flixton. That's a Flixton Werewolf account that's been moved into the Beast of Barmston Drain to give it more credibility. Not to take anything away from the people who've seen the thing at Barmston. Please understand that, listeners. That is not what I'm trying to do. I'm just saying that if we're going to do research and try and get any amount of credibility, regardless of how bizarre this subject might be, we're leaving ourselves open if we start moving accounts from one place to another just to add weight to your own story. Does that make sense, Vic?
That does make sense. Before we press on, Paul, I'd like to go back and ask you about those men who were paced on their mountain bikes that night. They told you there was plenty enough light to get a good look at that creature that was following them. Did they ever tell you if it had a muzzle or not?
He said it looked like a gorilla, so I would imagine it had a flat face, Vic. Now, they saw its eyes, but it didn't have red glowing eyes, but it was looking at them as they were pacing. It terrified them. No, they didn't say it had a muzzle. They said it looked like an upright gorilla.
Okay, I see. Keep in mind there's a kind of cryptid out there called a Type 3. Whereas Type 3s have muzzles and claws on their fingertips and toes, it'd be easy, depending on the angle that you saw it from, it would be easy to mistake one for a gorilla or a Sasquatch even, depending on the size of that Type 3.
You make a brilliant point there, Vic, and I didn't know about a Type 3, I've got to admit. That might tie in with some of the things that we might say later. You know, I didn't ask about a muzzle, so I'm not trying to make your assumption sound correct, but you are correct in the fact that I never asked if it had a muzzle. He just said it looked like an upright gorilla. You must press me, Vic, because I do say, I'll put this on and I'll not get round to it because I'll be on with something else. I will put it on for you, or parts of it, so I don't disclose this guy's identity. He doesn't actually say it has a muzzle. He says, I think actually he's saying it looks as in shape of an upright gorilla. So the point you made there, Vic, is quite relevant.
When you consider the kind of stress that man and his friend would be under, it would make a lot of sense that they wouldn't stop their bikes and take the time to stare at this thing that was coming after them, or at least pacing them. So I could definitely see a situation where they might not have had a good enough of look to know if it did or did not have a muzzle. So that's why I was curious about that and the fact that, like I just said, a Type 3, except for the face and the fact that a Type 3 has claws on its fingertips and toes, whereas a Sasquatch has fingernails and toenails, they look very similar in appearance, and from a certain angle, you could mistake them as gorillas. That's why I was asking about that, just curious to see if maybe that's not what happened.
That could very well be it, to be honest with you. You know, I mean, I would not discount that. the fact that you're saying, yeah, they're not actually going to slow the bikes down and think, well, let's just have a good look at this thing. They knew that there was something that were probably 7 foot tall, pacing them 30 feet away at the other side of some bracken. You're correct, Vic. They're not going to stop and think, we need to have a good look at this because we're not going to forget this in a hurry. They were actually trying to get out of the way. I think they said they came to the bottom of the hill and this thing just sort of veered off and they carried on going. We'll say they went to the right and this thing carried on going to the left. I don't even know if that's the case. I know that they just carried on going when they got to the bottom of the hill and they sort of lost sight of it. But yeah, it is quite a strange one. Upright gorilla, its description, 7 to 8 feet tall, 3 mountain bikers. And they all sort of saw this thing. I've only got the account of one of them. This guy who told me about it, in fact, Vic, told me probably 12 months ago. And I pestered him to talk again, but his fear was that I was going to try and contact his friends. And they don't want to talk about it. And he didn't want them involved in it. Anyway, I assured him I wouldn't, and I'd keep his name out of it, and I just got what I could when I last met him.
I'm glad you got the information that you got out of him. Speaking of that interview, just curious, did he ever tell you if he did or didn't hear it make any sounds when all this was going on?
That's a fact. They never heard a thing. That were another thing that put it into the sort of paranormal realms for me, shall we say, because I asked him, I said, could you hear branches snapping and cracking and this thing, if it's 7 or 8 feet tall, is going to weigh at least 300 pounds, surely to God. And they heard nothing. But once again, 30 foot away, they're off down a path. Are they going to hear it? Once adrenaline kicks in and you start moving, a quick sideward glance, it's still there. A quick sideward glance, it's still there. Are you going to hear it? I don't know.
That is a really good point. Yeah, I think worrying about the sounds it's making is going to be the last thing on your mind.
It is, Vic. And then, from that account, Vic, there's a guy who lives in Grindle. Grindle is probably, everything's close around here. Grindle will be 5 miles away, and I'm next to the coast, so once again, we're very close to the coast. And it's from the 1970s, and used to set a lot of snares and do quite a lot of hunting for rabbits and hare and pheasant in the 70s. So we're going back quite a long time. And he was with someone else on this particular occasion, daylight, checking his snares. And he said he reckons for a few weeks all his snares, he says, I could go to a certain place and I'd guarantee getting game. He says, but I just weren't getting it. He says, now we're finding game that had been ragged, his words, ragged out of the snares. So I couldn't understand it. He says, I knew it wasn't another poacher taking the wildlife because these things had just been ragged out of the snares. They'd not been carefully removed. They'd just been ripped out. And this particular day, they're looking across some fields, him and this other chap. He said, and there's a hedge about 6 foot tall. He says, and they could hear some noise and commotion at the other side, and it's, 400 or 500 yards away to the other side of this field, and they've got 410 shotguns, as well as the gear that they use for the rabbiting and all the other sort of things that they're going to use. And next thing they know, this thing's jumped over the hedge. Rob informs me that the other side of that hedge, there's a 4-foot drop. So he thinks this thing has leapt, going on for 10 foot. He said, and this thing dropped on the ground on all fours. He says, I thought it were a pony. Now, that's not an unusual statement with things of this nature in the UK, because I think, as I said to you before, Vic, we've got nothing to compare them to. We've got deer, but we've no big sort of predator or any animal to compare these things to. He says, and I thought it were a small pony. He says, and it's there on all fours. He says, but it's crouched. He says, and I thought, it's a lion. His exact words, he says, I thought it were a lion. And well, he swore, actually. He says, I thought it were a lion. He says, and then, I says, because it was huge. He says, but I realised it was some kind of dog. He says, well, my mate, he says, starts tapping on a piece of wood and whistling. He said, I wanted to punch him. He says, and I grabbed hold of him. He says, if that thing comes across me, he says, we're dead. He says, and we're looking at this bloody thing. And he says, and it's looking at us. And it's there in some kind of crouched stance. I can't picture the stance. Well, I can, but I can't describe it. You might all be seeing what I'm seeing in your mind's eye. He says, and it's huge. He says, but it's no dog. He says, but it's no lion either. He says, but it's come over. He says, and at first I thought it was a lion. He says, and we're watching it for, I don't know, I'm not going to say a few minutes. They're watching it for a short time. He says, and then it literally turned and launched itself back over the hedge where it had just come from. He says, I've never seen out like it before or since in my life. And he believes that's what we're taking his game for a few weeks. But everything's localised, Vic. Everything... Grindle is probably 9 miles from Flixton. Flixton is probably 20 miles from Sand's End, maybe 25 miles from Sand's End. Then if you come other way to where I live in Bridlington, we're 6 miles from Barmston, where people are seeing what they call the werewolf, the alleged creature of Barmston Drain. So these things, I mean, just like the farmer said at Fulton, this thing was fast. They're going to be able to cover a monstrous amount of distance in a short time, and I don't know what the territory of these things would be, or I've no idea of the sort of circumference or area of land that these things would want to frequent, but it sounds to me, or seems to me, that sort of local to this area, within probably, if we put a dot in the map where I live at Bridlington and go 30 miles either side, a 60-mile radius, well, can't be radius because we've got the sea, but a 30-mile pie chart, these things are covering a 60-mile circumference, probably 30 miles inland as well. So, it really is interesting. I'm not drawn one way or other to whether it's a flesh and blood creature or something paranormal, and I said that last time, so I'm sorry if my views sort of conflict with other people's. I mean, I do realise that there is people that have had up-close and personal encounters with these things, and they'd sort of tell me quite categorically and bluntly, this is a real flesh and blood thing. I'm not going to argue with them. They're in a better position than me. I just look at all these accounts that I sort of gather up, or the ones that I try to sort of gather and make sense of, and there's elements of it that don't make sense. If it is a predator, a flesh and blood predator, there's elements of that in these accounts. But then we've got a floating gorilla, or something like one, and with all these strange anomalies that don't seem to make sense at the same time. The fact that it seems oblivious to heavy artillery at times. The fact that it can just appear and disappear at will. All things that sort of point to it being something of another realm. And then we've got the other aspect of it, and the intelligence. I find the intelligence astounding, the fact that it seems to want to instill fear in people, which they don't seem to get with other predators or other animals. I mean, obviously we'd have fear if we saw a big cat or a bear. But these things, I don't know, listening to the descriptions and listening to the accounts of people, they seem to enjoy creating that element of fear. Now, I don't know any other animal, apart from us as human beings, that would actually know how to evoke a feeling of fear in a human. Confronted with a bear, you would have fear, but I've heard of them tapping on windows and rattling doorknobs, and yeah, that takes it out of the realm of a normal type of predator. Now, I've got 2 more short accounts of my own to share if you've time, Vic.
Please do.
Okay, well, after I'd done the shows with you last year, I believe it was, or it may have been late the year before, obviously you knew that I spend lots and lots of time around Flixton. Now, during my journeys to Flixton, I think I told listeners that I'd been to the Spittal Inn, which was built on the ruins of the old hospital that was built to protect travellers from the infestation of savage beasts at Spittal Corner in Flixton. Whilst there, I spoke to the lady who owned the property. After I'd looked at the deeds and we're talking and we were discussing a few things, and quite out of the blue, she went, I think there's a Bigfoot in them woods up at Flixton. And I sort of took it with a pinch of salt. I didn't think too much about it. I was more interested in gathering stories for the Flixton Werewolf, and she just come out with it, and I could see her looking at me to gauge my opinion, and I didn't dwell on it. But, obviously we're doing the Dogman stories, but I'd just like to touch on this if I may. I was up there early 2016, and I went on my own. Well, I took the little dog with me. Anybody who's seen photographs, you'll see my dog couldn't even tackle a rabbit, but he comes with me everywhere. So, we're wandering around Flixton and Staxton Wold. We'd been there hours and hours. So there's an area of wood that says trespassers will be prosecuted. And I don't mind saying I enter the wood a bit further down before the signs, so I haven't seen them. I'm armed with a camera, not a gun. So I'm wandering in these woods, nice and steady, just doing my own thing. I came to an area in the woodland that looked like it had been quarried. I need to explain that we're not looking at some huge quarry. We're looking at something 30 foot tall, 60 foot in circumference. And you could see where the rocks had been worked on and things had been taken out of the rocks. And once again, we've got all the trees, roots rippling round on surface because of this horrible chalky land. And I sort of paused and I'm looking at it. And I just heard 3 large, echoing tree knocks at the side of me. Now, there weren't a lot of growth on trees. All shrubs had sort of died back. A lot of leaves on ground. I sort of looked up. It were the echoing kind of knocks that you'd hear from a woodpecker. That's the best way to describe it. And I'm looking up and I flicked a voice recorder on if I'm being truthful because I wanted to see if it would replicate it. And I heard nothing more. I stayed there for probably, 20 minutes. My little dog sat down and just sort of contemplated, and I left this voice recorder running. I was praying that these knocks would come again because it wasn't one of those, did I hear that? They were loud and they were next to me. That's what I couldn't understand. They were actually next to me. So close. Within feet. And I couldn't understand it. So, I don't know, probably 2 or 3 months later, I found myself up there again. I was drawn to this small bit of the woodland. And I'm in there and I just doing my own thing, sort of wandering about, got a little dog with me again, and I settled on the same area. There were the fallen tree. I sat on fallen tree and I just sort of sat and listened. And then suddenly, this one I want to throw out to you, Vic, because I want to know if there's any reason for this. I became aware of the most vile smell of sulphur. It absolutely stunk. And, it was just sickly. Rotten eggs 10 times over. It was just absolutely vile. I just couldn't understand it. I sat there, I thought, well, I don't know where it's come from. And I'm trying to comprehend why. After about 20 minutes, I'd sort of left the area. Obviously, I left the smell. I had a little walk back. The smell had gone. So, I don't know what to make of those 2 small little cameos of things that have happened while I've been up in Flixton and Staxton Wold Woods, Vic.
You never did see what made the sounds when you heard the knocking. You never did see what made that smell, but both incidents point towards it possibly being a Sasquatch. It's believed that Sasquatch might dunk themselves in pools, freshwater pools that are laden with sulfur to help keep mosquitoes away. Now, if we're talking about a time of year when the leaves are off the trees and everything like that, like you just mentioned, yeah, I don't think mosquitoes are going to be much of a problem. But that scent, the scent of sulfur, it is commonly reported when people talk about their Sasquatch encounters. The knocking that you heard, though, that's also very commonly reported from Sasquatch eyewitnesses, especially if it sounded to you like it was hardwood on hardwood. So it kind of points that direction. You didn't see what made the sounds. You didn't see what made that smell. But we can at least say that it does point that direction to the idea that it possibly was a Sasquatch.
No, I didn't see what made the smell. I didn't see what made the sound, Vic. Now, one interesting point with the stories of the Flixton Werewolf is they call it the Old Stinker. Once again, that is something that they've tried to link to Hull. That's from Flixton. Not that that matters. Like we've just said, we're not disrespecting the old witnesses. They've seen what they've seen. But the stories of the Old Stinker are from Flixton, which I don't know why it's been tagged that name. There's an old book that was written by a guy called, I think it's John Harris, the Ghost Hunter's Handbook, if anybody wants to look it up. And he writes about the Flixton Werewolf, saying it smells of sulphur, and called the Old Stinker. I don't know whether he names it the Old Stinker in the book, but he talks about it smelling of sulphur. And I found that uncanny, that I literally did smell that vile smell. And the tree knocks, Vic, I shouldn't have heard them so close. I couldn't understand why I couldn't see what had made them. Whatever it was, I mean, obviously something physically, and it must have been camouflaged, but to make 3 loud, hollow, reverberating knocks like that and me not be able to see where they've come from, I found amazing. I mean, I've since took Colin Keelty up into the same area. We didn't experience anything. Once again, full respect to Colin as well, because he's doing a good job in the area that he's working in, which isn't far from me. But we sort of had a few little expeditions up in that area, but we never experienced anything. But that sums up Flixton for me, Vic, and then there's just one more, if you've time to go through this one.
We definitely do have time for that, but before we move on, there is something I want to cover here on what you just mentioned about the sulfur. Dogman eyewitnesses do commonly report a strong smell of sulfur being present when they've had their encounters, but the tree knocks you mentioned point towards it being something other than a dogman.
Thank you, and I know it means very little to anybody, but because mostly I deal with other people's first-hand accounts if I can. But I definitely experienced them things, listeners, and, you know, I'd happily swear on my children's lives that I heard them tree knocks and I experienced that vile smell. Where it came from, I've no idea. The next one, or the last thing that I've really got to speak about, Vic, happened last week, last Thursday, if I'm being truthful. And now, I touched on the fact that we're spending a lot of time at Bempton trying to film these lights that are being seen over the North Sea when we first started talking, Vic. And I'm going up quite often. I think I've talked about Bempton before. The cliffs are 300 to 400 foot, and they're on edge at North Sea. And obviously, from Bempton you run to Sands End, and from other end you'd run to Hull and the Barmston Drain, where it becomes flat. But these cliffs are 300 to 400 foot cliffs, and we've been going up there. I say we, me and a young man called Andy Ramsden. Andy's 30, I think, 37. So he's not that young, but I'm 54, so he's young to me. So we've been going up there, setting tripods up and cameras, hoping to catch these lights that the fishermen have told me about. Some of the same fishermen who told me that they'd seen that creature at Sands End. And we were up there last Thursday. Now, it was quite a dark night. I also have one of these headlights with the Cree LEDs in it that cast a massive beam. I don't put it on. I try not to. I put it on only when I need to. And I set my cameras up. It's quite misty, to be honest with you. It's not thick mist, but it's quite misty overseas. And I put a towel over the camera so it don't get moisture on it. And there's another camera set up as well for Andy to use. And I'm looking over towards the cliffs, towards Flamborough. You know, the cliffs they're quite undulating, and they drop from like the level we're looking at down to 50 foot, and then the 100 foot away they'll rise to our level, and various dips. And in front of the cliffs, 20 to 30 foot away from the edge of the cliff, there's a 3-bar wooden fence that's about 42 inch high. Now, from the edge of the cliff, an animal sprung up. Andy didn't see it, but I did. I'd love to say it were a deer, but it come from edge of cliff. Now, these cliffs, once again, listeners, Google it, Bempton Cliffs. The sheer 300 to 400 foot drops. And it come from edge of cliffs, and it were fawn. It was sandy fawn colour, and it were a dark night. So for me to be able to see that tells me it were quite light coloured. It were a shabby fawn colour, and it were on 4 legs. And the reason I say deer is simply because that's the only thing I've got to compare it with in size. It were quite big. It could have even been bigger. I just got a glimpse of this thing moving like a greyhound. It were absolutely lightning. But it just seemed to spring up from the edge of the cliff and go. Now, I never saw it clear the fence. I didn't see it clear the fence, but it must have cleared the 3-bar fence. And I could hear it then going up off field. Now, I told Andy, and I'm pointing to it, because I'm already on it when I've seen it come up. And I'm pointing to it going along the field, but he didn't see it. I mean, it was that quick that it's run the 20 or 30 feet, jumped the fence, and it's on the field sort of behind us, running, before Andy had sort of got a bead on it. Or I think it took me by surprise, to be honest with you, because I sort of went, what the hell is that? Or words to that effect. This thing were really quick. So we stayed there then for probably another 2 hours. I kept mentioning it throughout the period. Just what it was. I can't believe it were a deer because it come from the edge of the cliff. What would a deer be doing sort of springing up from edge of cliff. That's all I can say, because it just seemed to appear. And I don't know, I think probably 9:30, 10 o'clock, because we'd been there quite early. We set off back. Now, to the car park from the cliff edge, it's probably about 500 yards. And when I say car park, it's not something that's frequented by many people. It's an RSPB nature reserve. There's nobody there on a night. So, behind the nature reserve, to the other side, is a field that's called the Lays, which is interesting if you're interested in the UFO and the paranormal type of aspect, because obviously the lays and the ley lines. So we're looking over to this field called the Lays, and I flicked the headlight on, the LED headlight, as I'm walking up the path. Pitch black. There's no street lights, there's nothing on, absolutely nothing for miles. And I saw eye shine, and I just said to Andy, "Can you see that?" And he didn't know at first, and he went, "Oh, what's that?" I said, "Well, you tell me." Now, bear in mind, we've spent a lot of time around Danesdyke, Flixton, and I've seen, I won't say everything, because I'm no expert, but I've seen deer, I've seen rabbit, badger. So we're looking at these white, pink, glowing eyes, but big eyes. There's no fences up, so there's no livestock, bear in mind, when I'm relating this story. There's nothing. There's a fence round the top of the cliffs, before anybody wants to correct me, to stop people falling over into the North Sea. But the open land behind it, that's exactly what it is, open land. So before anybody thinks that I'm looking at a cow or something like that. So I've got the headlight on this, and it's the big eyes, and the sort of oval, and I don't know what we're looking at. So I bought me, with that much equipment, I have a fishing box. I dropped the box down. It's slightly drizzling. And I said to Andy, let's just watch this for a while, and I've got the light on it. But we can't see a shape behind the eyes. We can't see a body or anything. And then it blinks. We could see it blink. Anybody, I don't mean who does not believe me, but anybody who wants to verify this story, look up Andy Ramsden on Facebook and ask him, because he'll tell you the same story. Now, Andy was looking at it, "Did you see it then?" And it blinked. This thing, it's real slow. Its eyes closed, and then they opened, and then it sort of ducked down, and it vanished. So we're contemplating, and then it appears again. Its eyes come again. Oh, it lifts its head, and it's looking at us again from the same place. I know what you're going to think next, Vic, when I tell you this. Off I goes. I armed myself with this Canon D800 camera, put it on, don't know what I'm going to take, and I'm up over the bank. I'm going to walk out towards it. So then I slowly starts walking across the field, snapping pictures. It's taking ages. The lens isn't equipped to cope with the pictures I'm taking in the dark. But I snapped 8 pictures as I'm walking towards it. So it dropped its head again. I can hear Andy saying in the background, "Paul, I don't like this. I want to go." Speak to him online, anybody. He'll answer your questions. He's a really such an amiable kind of fella. And now it dropped its head again and vanished. And I sort of turned to Andy and says, "Where's it gone?" At this time, it was about the height of a large dog. Now, it appeared again a bit further away. So I carried on walking. And it did this till I were about probably, I don't know, 500 or 600 foot out into the field. And I turned to Andy, and in the lights he went, "Paul, there's another one." Now I didn't see it, and he caught a glimpse of another set of eyes, the same, parallel to me further up the field. So I sort of felt a little bit unnerved at that point, and I turned and I came back, because Andy says, "I could see you doing old man run back to me." Now when we got back to the path, I put the light on, it had come back. This thing had come back and was in the same position, or the same spot, or a very similar spot. The same spot would not be right. I was talking silly there. A very similar spot within the length of the beam to where it was originally. Now, we weren't imagining it and fixing on something that were a fixed target. This thing was dropping its head. This thing was blinking. Now, we watched it, and he pointed to where the other one was, because he thought it was that one at first. He thought, because that one had dropped its gaze, and I swept around, he thought it had moved to the side of me, but then he realised there was actually 2. Now, this thing had moved back to when we first saw it. But this time it's starting to rain, well, quite heavy. So we made us way back up the path. But within this, when I said it was about the height of a dog, and Andy commented the same as what I commented, we thought this thing got down on its belly. This might sound stupid. It got that low. And the eyes were so big, as Andy will tell you or tell anyone, it were big. This were big. This had a big head. And we thought it must have got down on its belly at some point, because it seemed to be looking at us from the grass, like laid down afterwards. It was just bizarre. It was a strange thing. But once again, we're on the same stretch of coast from Bempton to Sands End to Barmston, where all these things are being seen. Now, I can't say that we saw a Dogman, because I really don't know. I don't know what the creature was that sprung up from the cliffs. I think I'd put my life on it that it weren't a deer. It just seemed to appear, but it was size of a deer, and it didn't. People who know me will know I go all over the place, and I'll probably still end up in Flixton and all over, but that has actually stopped me going to Bempton on my own. I've got to admit, that one incident of eye shine, the fact that there were another set of eyes further up that were very similar, the fact that I walked towards it was as though I were being led out into the field. And if it weren't for Andy saying there's another one further up the field, parallel with you, I probably would have carried on going. Now, I literally just turned back and I ran back, which is probably a stupid thing to do if there were a predator after you, because they don't want to say it like that, or they do. That's the green light. But as you know, and then we stood on the path and it had come back to where we first observed it. Now, that is not the behaviour of a deer or a rabbit or a fox or any kind of animal that I know in the UK. And plus the fact that the eyes were huge, and it weren't froze in the light, it weren't froze in the beam, it turned away. And I don't know if I touched on the guy that saw the creature at Sands End, the rock angler. He said that every time he put the light on it, it got the eye shine, but it dropped its gaze, but carried on coming. It dropped its head, but carried on coming. It didn't like the light. So, it sort of turn the light away, turn it on again, and it's there, and drop its gaze and carry on coming, and he thinks it was hunched over. Now, I've not got any suggestion that this thing was hunched over. What we both can't understand is why we couldn't actually see a head or the outline, because it's a powerful light, and these eyes were bloody huge. But no, just a quite unnerving one for me, and one that I have to admit has stopped me going up Bempton on my own. And that's about all I've got for you, Vic.
Well, I can understand that getting your attention to the point where you decided to stop heading up that way. And to answer your question about how you could have a powerful beam shining on a creature like that and still not be able to see its outline, for whatever reason, black dogmen, they seem to have this quality to their fur, the same quality that bison have, where the fur actually seems to absorb light. If you shine a light, even a bright headlight, on a bison's fur, you'll notice that it doesn't reflect any of that light back. It's almost like it absorbs it. So you won't tend to see an outline in very dark conditions like what you were talking about. Now, you didn't know for sure that this was a dogman that you saw, but that is an explanation for how it could be a situation where you could have a powerful beam shining on this thing and you still couldn't see an outline for it.
Right, Vic. Well, honestly, thank you. And there is one more thing, actually, when you touched on the fur. If we can just quickly go back to Hasthorpe and the guy that said he saw the slinking shoulders that looked like a cat's at the other side of the hedge at the bottom of his paddock, and the body of a dog, or the top part of the body of the dog. I asked him about the fur. I said, was it shiny? Because I obviously thought if it's a cat, if it's a big cat, we're going to see like a glistening panther-type sheen to the fur. And he said it was very rough and dog-like fur. Just one little thing. I'm sorry to throw that one back at you, but it just sort of come to me then when you were speaking.
Oh no, I'd love to hear anything you'd like to share at any time. That's no problem. Are there any fissures at the edge of that cliff that creature could be using to gain access to caves down below?
Brilliant. I wish I'd have thought of making a note of that before we spoke, Vic. There is, yeah. Once again, I know your listeners like to do research as well. Flamborough, Bempton, Speeton. Google it. Look for sea caves, and you will see that there are not just 10 or 20, there are hundreds of sea caves above the waterline that have been documented but haven't been explored because of the inaccessible nature. This is things I've read myself, because I looked into that, Vic. I thought, well, the rock angler at Sand's End said he wondered if these things were eating gulls, seagulls and gannets and things, because at Bempton, it might not seem much of a mouthful, but we don't just have hundreds. We've got probably the biggest seabird colony in the world on these cliffs of gannets and seabirds, mounting to thousands and thousands. I'm not saying that they're going to be eating gulls. I mean, I can't see them traversing and being able to pluck birds off. I don't know how they operate, but there's literally thousands of seabirds on these cliffs. But yes, in answer to your question, Vic, it's absolutely riddled with sea caves that are above the waterline.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, that would fit. That would be a perfect home for a Dogman, and with all those gannets around that area, like you just said, that'd be a perfect food source for them. In the areas that we've been talking about where these quote-unquote werewolves have been seen, are there a lot of deer in these areas they could feed on, or is it mostly small game that they would have to subsist on?
No, there's a plentiful supply of deer, Vic. The area, there's lots of roe deer. It's absolutely full of pheasant, partridge, hare, rabbit. There'd be no shortage of food for these things. The only obstacle I would see would be, why are they picking on wild game when there's sheep wandering about? I'm not discounting the fact that these things exist and are real. I absolutely believe it. So I don't think I'm trying to contradict what anyone thinks or says. I do believe they're real. I'm just absolutely 100% certain. But we've got far more easy targets in the form of sheep, goats and cattle. So why aren't we seeing carcasses of these animals strewn all over the place? And why are we concentrating on deer, hare, partridge and pheasant? It's just a question I've sort of turned on its head. I realise maybe that's their chosen diet. I don't know.
Yeah, when you consider how hard it would be to catch wild game, why wouldn't they target sheep and goats and other animals like that are penned up and much easier prey? You mentioned in those areas that doesn't seem to be the case, but in any of the areas where all these quote-unquote werewolf sightings are taking place, are there many dogs, cats, livestock that are turning up missing, or are they seemingly being left alone?
I've not heard of dogs going missing, but obviously because I do quite a lot of research and visiting archives, you do get spates of cats going missing in concentrated areas, but they're in populated areas. I wouldn't say overly populated areas, but in Queensgate, in Bridlington, for instance, in 2009, over 30 cats disappeared over about, 2 or 3 weeks. Quite a sad thing. People will be thinking, how does he know that? Because when you go into archives and you start researching these things, you just notice missing cats. I'm not looking for them, actually. Sometimes it's there in plain sight, and it's only after a week, 2 or 3 weeks, and you look at things and you think, cats, and then you look again, and then you decide you're going to count them. And 30-odd cats disappeared in 2009 in Queensgate, and various places the cats have disappeared. Quite why, I don't know, Vic. But funnily enough, Queensgate is the place where I told you I thought I experienced something behind a hedge as I was walking home in the early hours one night. But I'd no proof of anything Dogman related. I just know that there was something at the other side of the edge that made me feel uneasy. But getting back to your question, Vic, there's a plentiful supply of wild game around this area in the form of deer, hare, rabbit, pheasant, you name it, muntjac deer, roe deer, it's all there, and not just few and far between. There's absolutely hundreds and hundreds of them.
Yeah, that would be an excellent food supply for them. You just mentioned Colin Keelty, who of course was a guest on the show not all that long ago. You also mentioned the fact you two have done some researching together. Please tell us more about your outings with him.
Yeah, I met up with Colin actually due to your show, so thank you for that. And turns out he's a real nice, genuine kind of guy, and we've been up Flixton, we've spent time in that wood, we've gone round looking at what I considered the branch anomalies. I've took him to Danes Dyke to look at the other branch anomalies. I don't know what they've got to do with the Flixton Werewolf, but we're finding these strange branch structures and things around that area. But Colin's had his own experiences in area where he is, and we've got a few more trips planned during the next few months, hopefully. We're wanting to get some frost or snow on the ground to see whether we can see tracks or find any more clues, and basically we'll just be out there looking. He's on a similar vein to me. He's probably not, I don't want to speak for Colin, I don't think he believes so much in the paranormal type interdimensional aspect of the subject as what I probably lean to, but that's good, because I might not be right, you know what I mean? And Colin might be absolutely on the money with his theories and assumptions, just as many other people will be. I just think it's good to get a collection of different minds together. We might come up with some kind of answer. You know, it might be totally different to what we're expecting, but nevertheless, I don't care if I'm wrong. We've just got to keep looking.
Colin's a good man just like you are, so I can see you two making a great team. It's good to hear that you're working together.
Yeah, he is excellent. I'm really glad that I've sort of teamed up with him. I really am.
He is a really good guy. Well, Paul, it's about time for us to get out of here. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
Just once again, thank you very much for listening to my views, and please remember, there may be experts out there and there may be people that actually know, but I'm not one of them. I collect the accounts. I've had a few strange experiences myself. I can't say everybody is telling the truth, but I do question why someone would come up with such a bizarre story about seeing such a creature and then be so reluctant to share it. So we all know, and the people that are listening to this show, these things are real. All we can do, we just have to dig, we have to ask the questions, we have to remain open-minded, and if my views don't agree with other people's, then I'm sorry. If yours don't agree with mine, I'm sorry. I'm not going to argue with you, because at the end of the day, you could be right, I could be right. We've just got to keep looking and keep working together, and eventually we might come up with some kind of answer. That's about all I could say, Vic.
Very well said, Paul. Well, thanks again so much, Paul, for coming back on the show. You know, I really appreciate your time. Have a great night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.